Sarah Thompson's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the courthouse, each step echoing through the cavernous hallway as she hurried toward traffic courtroom 302. The morning sun streamed through towering windows, casting long shadows that stretched across the worn wooden benches lining the corridor. She clutched a manila envelope containing her carefully prepared evidence, time-stamped photographs, witness statements, and a detailed report from the city's traffic department about the malfunctioning light. Running her fingers through her expertly styled hair, Sarah checked her reflection in a nearby window. Her charcoal gray suit was immaculate, chosen specifically for its professional cut and subtle authority. As the CEO of a major design house, she understood the power of presentation, even for something as mundane as a traffic violation hearing. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 302 groaned as she pushed them open, stepping into the hushed atmosphere of justice in progress. The room smelled of lemon polish and aged wood, an aroma that spoke of tradition and authority. Several other defendants sat in various states of anxiety on the hard wooden benches, while a court officer stood at attention near the judge's bench. Judge Richard Bennett presided over his domain with the detached air of someone who had heard every excuse imaginable. His new silk robe caught the harsh fluorescent light, creating an almost ethereal glow around his shoulders. The irony of that particular garment was still unknown to him, though it would soon become a pivotal detail in their shared story. Case number 2347. Sarah Thompson, charged with failure to stop at a red light, the clerk announced, her voice carrying through the acoustically perfect room. Sarah approached the podium, her posture straight and confident. "Good morning, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured. Judge Bennett barely glanced up from his papers, his pen tapping impatiently against the bench. "Miss Thompson, how do you plead?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I have evidence that the traffic light was malfunctioning that evening." Sarah began to remove the documents from her envelope. "I have photographs showing the signal stuck between cycles, and statements from 3 witnesses who experienced similar issues at the same intersection that week. Additionally, I've obtained a report from the Department of Transportation confirming." "Miss Thompson," Judge Bennett interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes swept over her dismissively, lingering for just a moment too long on her perfectly tailored suit before returning to his papers. "This court sees dozens of traffic violations every day. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone has a story. The officer's report clearly states you proceeded through a red light." "Your Honor, if you'll just look at the evidence," Sarah tried again, her heart rate quickening as she sensed the direction this was heading. "That will be enough." The judge cut her off sharply. The defendant seated behind her shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. Just 20 minutes earlier, they had watched the same judge patiently listen to a young white college student explain how his speedometer was faulty, eventually reducing his fine. Judge Bennett scribbled something on his papers. "The court finds you guilty. The fine will be $400, double the standard amount due to your waste of the court's time with these excuses." Next case. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her evidence still clutched in her hands. The fine wasn't just about the money. Her company had grossed millions last year. It was about the principle, about being dismissed without even the pretense of a fair hearing. As she gathered her documents, she noticed her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a combination of anger and determination. What Judge Bennett didn't know, as he sat high on his bench in his gleaming new robe, was that this moment would return to him in the most unexpected way. The woman he had just fined wasn't just another face in his courtroom. She was Sarah Thompson, founder and chief designer of Thompson Judicial Wear, the very company that had crafted the robe he wore with such authority. The courthouse hallway seemed longer now as Sarah made her way toward the exit, her heels no longer clicking with the same confidence they had carried earlier. The morning sun that had seemed so promising now felt harsh and accusatory through the tall windows. She stopped at a wooden bench, needing a moment to collect herself before facing the rest of her day. As she began organizing the untouched evidence back into her manila envelope, her phone buzzed with notifications about an upcoming board meeting, a reminder that in any other setting, she was the one commanding respect. "Miss Thompson, please, wait," a voice called out behind her, accompanied by hurried footsteps. Sarah turned to see a young clerk rushing toward her, clutching what appeared to be a fashion magazine to her chest. The clerk's black flats skidded slightly on the polished floor as she came to a stop, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and embarrassment. "I'm Jennifer Monroe, Judge Bennett's assistant clerk," she said, slightly out of breath. "I couldn't believe it when I saw your name on today's docket. You are Sarah Thompson of Thompson Judicial Wear, aren't you? I recognized you from last month's profile in Fashion Law Quarterly." Sarah straightened her spine, muscle memory from countless business meetings taking over. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her professional mask sliding back into place, despite the morning's humiliation still burning in her chest. Jennifer opened the magazine with trembling fingers, revealing a glossy spread featuring Sarah in her design studio, surrounded by sketches and swatches of luxurious fabrics. "Your story is incredible. How you revolutionized judicial wear by introducing modern textiles while maintaining traditional dignity. We just received the new catalog yesterday, and—" She trailed off, her enthusiasm faltering as the full weight of what had transpired in the courtroom seemed to hit her. "Judge Bennett," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "he's been talking about your designs for months. He doesn't know it, but he's wearing one of your classic collection robes right now. The whole courthouse is preparing to place a major order with your company for the upcoming judicial investiture ceremony." Sarah's hand froze in the act of putting away her evidence. The irony of the situation washed over her in waves. The very man who had dismissed her so readily was literally wrapped in her craftsmanship. She remembered designing that particular robe, how she had insisted on reinforcing the shoulders to create a more commanding silhouette. The exact shade of black she had selected to convey authority while catching the light in a way that suggested wisdom. "He's been particularly interested in commissioning a custom design," Jennifer continued, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Just yesterday, he was showing everyone the page featuring your new heritage line. He said, and I quote, 'This designer truly understands the gravitas of the judicial position.'" A small, incredulous laugh escaped Sarah's lips before she could stop it. "Gravitas," she repeated softly, remembering how quickly he had dismissed her evidence without so much as a glance. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably, clutching the magazine tighter. "The fitting and consultation is scheduled for next week. He's been insisting on meeting the designer personally to discuss his vision for the perfect robe." She paused, watching Sarah's expression carefully. "Nobody here knows you're the owner and chief designer. They're expecting someone else," Sarah finished for her, understanding perfectly what remained unsaid. She had encountered similar assumptions throughout her career, which was precisely why she had chosen to let her work speak for itself, rarely appearing at initial client meetings. Standing there in the courthouse hallway, Sarah felt a plan beginning to form. The evidence of traffic light malfunction might not have interested Judge Bennett, but perhaps there was a different kind of evidence she could present. Evidence of his own prejudices, wrapped in the very garment he wore while delivering his biased justice. 10 years earlier, Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor of her tiny studio apartment, surrounded by scraps of fabric and half-finished sketches. The clock on her microwave blinked 3:47 a.m., but she barely noticed. Her fingers were pricked with countless needle marks, and her eyes burned from squinting at fine stitching under inadequate lighting. A half-empty cup of cold coffee sat forgotten among the chaos of her makeshift workshop. The idea had come to her during her final year at Parsons School of Design. While other students dreamed of runway shows and celebrity clientele, Sarah had noticed an overlooked niche in the fashion industry. Her mother, a longtime courthouse clerk, had often complained about the poor quality of judicial robes, how they trapped heat, wrinkled easily, and lost their shape after minimal wear. "These robes are supposed to represent justice," her mother would say, "but they can't even survive a washing machine." Sarah picked up one of her early prototypes, running her fingers over the seams. She had spent months interviewing judges, sitting in on court sessions, and studying the history of judicial garments. Most designers saw robes as mere uniforms, but Sarah recognized them as symbols of authority that needed to embody both tradition and innovation. Her breakthrough came after a particularly frustrating meeting with a fabric supplier who insisted traditional materials were the only option. That night, she had walked through a sudden downpour, her wool blazer becoming heavy and uncomfortable in the rain. But her silk blouse beneath remained surprisingly comfortable. The contrast sparked an idea. Working with a textile engineer she'd met during an internship, Sarah developed a revolutionary wool-silk blend that breathed like high-performance athletic wear while maintaining the dignified appearance of traditional judicial garments. The material was nearly impossible to wrinkle and regulated temperature naturally. She named it Justice Wear, though she knew the success of her innovation would depend on more than just clever branding. Her first sale came from an unlikely source. A young judge had spilled coffee on his robe minutes before court was in session. In desperate need of a replacement, he had stumbled upon Sarah's small shop near the courthouse. The robe she sold him was one of only 3 she had managed to produce, priced well below its actual value, just to get it into the marketplace. 2 weeks later, the judge returned with 3 colleagues. "Whatever you did to make this robe," he had said, placing an order for 2 more. "It's revolutionary. I've never been more comfortable on the bench." Sarah glanced at the vision board still hanging above her sewing machine, now surrounded by awards and press clippings. The headline from her first major feature in a legal fashion magazine read, "Thompson Judicial Wear, Where Tradition Meets Innovation." The article had caught the attention of a prominent investment firm specializing in minority-owned businesses, leading to the capital injection that transformed her one-woman operation into a proper company. Now, a decade later, Thompson Judicial Wear occupied the entire 10th floor of a Manhattan office building. Her client list included Supreme Court justices, federal judges, and prestigious law schools across the country. Each robe was still crafted with the same attention to detail she had insisted upon in her tiny apartment, though now she had a team of skilled artisans working under her guidance. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her production manager about Judge Bennett's upcoming robe fitting. She smiled, remembering all the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. Each slight had only fueled her determination to succeed, to prove that excellence knows no color or gender. The same determination now stirred in her chest as she considered the upcoming meeting with Judge Bennett. She would face him not as a defendant in traffic court, but as the designer whose work he admired. The creator of the very robe he had worn while dismissing her case. Sometimes, she reflected, justice wore unexpected faces. Judge Richard Bennett sat in his chambers, the afternoon light filtering through Venetian blinds and casting striped shadows across his mahogany desk. The Thompson Judicial Wear catalog lay open before him, its glossy pages displaying the latest innovations in judicial fashion. His fingers traced the embroidered patterns of a particularly striking design as he admired the craftsmanship evident even in the photographs. "The attention to detail is remarkable," he mused, adjusting the collar of his own Thompson robe. These newer designs somehow managed to feel both modern and timeless. He hadn't removed the garment even though court had ended hours ago. Something about it just felt right, like authority made tangible. Jennifer Monroe, still carrying the weight of her earlier encounter with Sarah Thompson, stood quietly by the door. She watched as her boss, usually so quick to judge and dismiss, spent minutes studying each page with genuine appreciation. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. "Did you schedule that meeting with their designer?" Bennett asked, not looking up from a page featuring their heritage collection. "I have some specific ideas about modifications to their classic design that I'd like to discuss." "Yes, Your Honor," Jennifer replied, her voice carefully neutral. "The designer will be here next Tuesday at 2 p.m. She clutched her tablet tighter, fighting the urge to reveal what she knew. The judge's treatment of Sarah Thompson in traffic court that morning still burned in her mind. Excellent. Bennett leaned back in his leather chair, finally looking up. You know, in my 30 years on the bench, I've never worn anything quite like their robes. There's something about the way they drape, the way they move. It adds a certain gravitas to the proceedings. He chuckled. Though I suppose that sounds rather pompous. The chamber's door opened, and Court Administrator Douglas Chen entered with a stack of papers. I see you're still swooning over the Thompson catalog, Rich, he said with a knowing smile. I just finished reviewing their proposal for the courthouse-wide order. Their pricing is actually quite reasonable considering the quality. It's not just the quality, Bennett responded, turning the catalog around to show a close-up of intricate stitching. Look at these subtle details, the reinforced shoulders, the precisely angled sleeves. Whoever designs these understands that a judicial robe isn't just a garment. It's a symbol of our entire justice system. Jennifer suppressed a bitter laugh that threatened to escape. The irony was almost too much to bear. I heard their designer studied the historical significance of judicial robes extensively, Douglas added, setting down his papers. Apparently, they interviewed hundreds of judges about their experiences before developing their signature fabric blend. Bennett nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thoroughness we need. Too many people these days want to rush through things, make excuses, cut corners. He trailed off, momentarily remembering the morning's traffic court session, though not with any particular regret. Speaking of thoroughness, Jennifer interjected, unable to completely hide the edge in her voice. Would you like to review the morning's cases before they're filed? She held out the traffic court docket, Sarah Thompson's name clearly visible among the day's defendants. No need. Bennett waved his hand dismissively. Standard procedures, standard outcomes. Nothing remarkable about traffic court. He returned his attention to the catalog, completely missing Jennifer's tight-lipped expression. As the afternoon sun continued its journey across the chamber walls, Judge Bennett remained absorbed in the catalog, imagining how he would look in each new design. He had no idea that in less than a week, he would come face to face not just with Thompson Judicial Ware's designer, but with his own prejudices, wrapped in the very fabric he so admired. The same hands he had dismissed that morning had crafted the robe he wore with such pride, a fact that would soon shatter his carefully maintained worldview in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Sarah stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan office, Judge Bennett's business card pinched between her fingers as she watched the city bustle below. The same card that Jennifer had nervously handed her in the courthouse hallway now represented a crossroads. Her design table behind her was already scattered with preliminary sketches for his custom robe, each one a potential statement about justice and prejudice. Cancel the meeting, her PR director had advised during their morning briefing. We can send the sales team, cite a scheduling conflict. There's no need to subject yourself to that man again. The concern in her voice was genuine, but Sarah had detected a hint of fear that confrontation might damage their carefully cultivated brand. Sarah placed the business card on her desk, next to the traffic court citation sheet framed as a reminder. The fine had already been paid, the amount insignificant to someone of her means, but the weight of that morning's dismissal still sat heavy in her chest, a familiar burden she carried too many times before. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. Remember what I always told you. Success is the best revenge, but wisdom is knowing how to serve it. Sarah smiled, remembering countless Sunday afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen, learning about dignity in the face of prejudice, while mastering the art of baking the perfect pound cake. Let them taste their assumptions, her grandmother would say, and watch them choke on their own bias. Turning back to her design table, Sarah ran her fingers over the sketches. Each one was technically perfect, embodying the quality Thompson Judicial Ware was known for, but none of them captured what she really wanted to express. With determined steps, she moved to her private workroom, where her most experimental designs took shape. What if, she murmured to herself, pulling fresh sketch paper from her drawer, the robe itself could tell a story. Her pencil began to move with purpose, crafting something entirely new. Into the traditional silhouette, she wove subtle elements of African textile patterns, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The shoulders, where Judge Bennett's authority sat most heavily, she designed with a special reinforcement technique inspired by Kent cloth weaving. Hours slipped by as Sarah refined every detail. The neckline incorporated a barely perceptible pattern of interconnected circles, representing the endless cycle of justice and consequence. The sleeves, where Bennett's hands would emerge to pass judgment, featured a whisper of a pattern suggesting broken chains. Every stitch would carry meaning. Every seam would tell a story of resilience and dignity. Her design director found her there at sunset, surrounded by fabric swatches and technical drawings. "Sarah," he said gently, "the team is worried. They think meeting the judge might be too confrontational." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We could send the new designs with a representative." Sarah held up her final sketch, now complete. "Do you know why I started this company?" she asked, though she didn't wait for an answer. "Not just to make better robes, but to change what people see when they look at justice. Sometimes that means facing prejudice with grace, showing excellence when they expect mediocrity, and standing tall when they want you to shrink." She picked up Judge Bennett's business card again, this time with certainty. "Confirm the meeting," she instructed, her voice firm. "But first, have the archive send up photos of every robe we've made for the courthouse in the last 5 years. When I walk into that conference room, I want to be armed with more than just designs." As her team scrambled to prepare for Tuesday's meeting, Sarah made one final modification to her sketch. In the robe's inner lining, visible only to the wearer, she added a small embroidered quote, "Justice wears many faces." It would be her silent testimony, a reminder sewn into every stitch that true authority comes not from a garment, but from the wisdom to wield it fairly. The courthouse conference room felt smaller than Sarah remembered it. Late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the polished surface of the oak table where her design portfolio lay perfectly centered. She had arrived 20 minutes early, arranging everything with precision. Fabric swatches to her left, technical drawings to her right, and a single copy of her company's latest catalog placed strategically at Judge Bennett's designated seat. Jennifer hovered near the door, her nervous energy palpable. "He's finishing up in court now," she said, checking her tablet for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "I haven't told him. I mean, he doesn't know." "It's all right," Sarah assured her, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her crimson blazer. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a designer suit that screamed success without saying a word. Some revelations are best served fresh. The murmur of voices in the hallway grew louder. Sarah recognized the judge's distinctive baritone, currently engaged in what sounded like a jovial conversation about golf handicaps. Her heartbeat quickened, but her expression remained composed, years of boardroom negotiations having taught her the power of a calm exterior. The door opened. Judge Bennett entered first, his Thompson judicial robe swishing impressively around his legs. 2 court administrators followed, along with a senior clerk Sarah didn't recognize. The judge's practiced smile froze mid-formation as his eyes fell on her, recognition dawning like a slow-motion car crash. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same clear, professional tone she'd used in his courtroom a week ago. "I believe you've been eager to meet the designer of your robe." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. The other officials, oblivious to the tension, began taking their seats. Judge Bennett remained standing, his authority suddenly as wrinkled as last season's clearance rack. "Ms. Thompson," he managed finally, her name catching slightly in his throat. His eyes darted to the robe he wore, then back to her face, as if connecting dots he never knew existed. "Please, sit," Sarah gestured to the chair at the head of the table. "I brought some exciting new designs I believe will interest you." Her smile was professional, but her eyes held the weight of their last encounter. Bennett lowered himself into the chair, his movements stiff and uncertain. The confidence he'd radiated in his courtroom had evaporated, replaced by something that looked remarkably like embarrassment. "I must say," one of the administrators broke in, "we're all such admirers of your work, Miss Thompson. The judge especially has been singing your company's praises for months." "Has he?" Sarah opened her portfolio with deliberate grace. "How gratifying to hear. I always appreciate feedback from our clients, especially those who take the time to truly examine the evidence of our craftsmanship." Bennett's cheeks flushed at her pointed reference. He reached for the catalog before him, perhaps seeking a moment to compose himself, but his hands weren't quite steady. "Your current robe," Sarah continued, her voice carrying just enough warmth to seem professional to the others, but enough edge for Bennett to feel its bite, "is from our classic collection. Notice how the shoulders are reinforced to create a more commanding presence. After all, authority should be carried with both dignity and awareness. Wouldn't you agree?" The judge tugged at his collar, the same collar he'd adjusted so confidently while dismissing her traffic violation. "The craftsmanship is exceptional," he managed. "Thank you," Sarah replied, pulling out her newest designs. "I believe in paying attention to every detail, giving each person who comes before me the full consideration they deserve. It's a principle I found essential in both design and justice." The other officials nodded appreciatively, completely missing the subliminal confrontation unfolding before them. But Judge Bennett saw it clearly now. In every precise movement of Sarah's hands, in every carefully chosen word, in the very garment he wore, he was experiencing what it felt like to be judged by appearances and found wanting. Sarah unfurled her designs across the conference table with the precision of a chess master setting up their pieces. Each movement was calculated, each design positioned to tell its own story. Judge Bennett sat rigid in his chair, trapped between professional obligation and personal discomfort, as the other officials leaned forward with genuine interest. "This first design," Sarah began, her manicured finger tracing the intricate patterns, "draws inspiration from various justice systems throughout history." She pulled out a fabric swatch in a deep obsidian shade. "The material itself is a new development. It maintains its depth of color even under harsh courtroom lighting, ensuring that every detail remains visible." "Remarkable texture," one of the administrators commented, reaching out to touch the fabric. "Yes," Sarah agreed, her eyes briefly meeting Bennett's. "I found that appearances can be deceiving until you take a closer look." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of his current robe suddenly feeling much heavier. She moved to the next design, unfolding it with deliberate care. "This pattern here," she indicated a series of interwoven circles near the collar, "represents the interconnected nature of justice. Each decision, each judgment, creates ripples that affect countless lives." Her voice carried just enough emphasis on judgment to make Bennett's jaw tighten. "The reinforced shoulders," she continued, drawing attention to the architectural details, "feature a unique weaving technique inspired by traditional African textiles. Each thread is carefully positioned to support the weight of authority, while remaining flexible enough to allow for movement and reflection." Jennifer, still standing near the door, couldn't suppress a small smile as she watched her boss squirm beneath the weight of Sarah's pointed presentation. "But the most innovative feature," Sarah said, turning to a final sketch, "is what I call the mirror lining." She revealed a detailed drawing of the robe's interior. The silk blend inside is treated with a subtle sheen, offering the wearer occasional glimpses of their own reflection during court proceedings. A reminder, you might say, of the importance of self-awareness in delivering justice. Judge Bennett tugged at his collar again, unable to miss the implications. The robe he currently wore suddenly felt like it was made of truth rather than fabric. "Miss Thompson," he managed, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority, "your attention to symbolism is quite thorough." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her smile professional, but her eyes unwavering. "I believe that those who wear these robes should understand the full weight of their responsibility. Every decision they make, Every person they encounter deserves careful consideration. Wouldn't you agree? The judge's face flushed slightly as he remembered their previous encounter. How quickly he had dismissed her. How easily he had doubled her fine without even glancing at her evidence. These designs, Sarah continued, pulling out one final sketch, represent more than just garments. They embody the principles of justice itself, fairness, equality, and the wisdom to look beyond surface appearances. She laid the sketch directly in front of Bennett. This one, I designed specifically with you in mind. The other officials murmured appreciatively, but Bennett could only stare at the drawing. The robe was masterfully designed, its lines speaking of authority and wisdom. But it was the subtle details that caught his eye. Patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on how you looked at them, just as truth itself often depended on perspective. The collar, Sarah explained, her voice carrying just enough edge to pierce his professional armor, is designed to draw the eye upward, suggesting aspiration toward higher justice. After all, she added, gathering her materials with practiced grace, we all benefit when those in authority take the time to look up from their papers and truly see the people standing before them. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of fabric samples. In that moment, Judge Bennett realized he was experiencing something rare in his profession. A sentence delivered not with a gavel, but with expertise, elegance, and exquisite precision. 2 months after the design consultation, Sarah stood in the courthouse rotunda, supervising the installation of a new display case. The morning light streamed through the dome above, casting a natural spotlight on the exhibition she'd curated, the evolution of judicial attire, from authority to enlightenment. Behind the gleaming glass, carefully staged robes told a story of transformation, not just in fashion, but in the very nature of justice itself. At the center, mounted with particular care, hung Judge Bennett's new robe, its subtle patterns catching the light in ways that seemed to change with every passing hour. Miss Thompson. A familiar voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to find Judge Bennett approaching, wearing the robe she had designed. The past 2 months had changed him. There was a different quality to his stride, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. Your Honor, she acknowledged, noting how he now carried the garment's weight differently. I see you're growing into the new design. Growing is the right word, he replied, his voice carrying a hint of hard-earned humility. I've been doing a lot of that lately. He gestured to the display case. This exhibition, it's more than just fashion history, isn't it? Sarah adjusted the lighting slightly, highlighting the intricate details of the center robe. Every garment tells a story, Your Honor. Some just speak louder than others. Bennett cleared his throat, clearly building up to something. I've been reviewing my cases from the past few years, he said, particularly my traffic court decisions. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. The disparities in my rulings were enlightening. Enlightenment often comes from unexpected sources, Sarah responded, thinking of her grandmother's wisdom about serving success with grace. I've implemented some changes, he continued. Every defendant now gets 3 full minutes to present their case. All evidence must be reviewed before judgment is passed. He smoothed the front of his robe, her robe, with a thoughtful gesture. The courthouse has also approved a new training program on implicit bias. I'll be leading it, wearing this robe as a reminder of my own learning curve. Sarah nodded, remembering the day she decided to face him with dignity rather than anger. Small changes can create significant ripples, Your Honor. Please, he said, call me Richard. He turned to study the exhibition. You know, I've been meaning to ask. These patterns here, he touched his collar. They seemed familiar somehow. They're adapted from an ancient African symbol meaning the weight of leadership, Sarah explained. My grandmother used to weave similar patterns into quilts. Each one told a story of resilience and dignity. A group of law students entered the rotunda, their excited whispers echoing off the marble walls as they recognized Sarah. Since the story of her confrontation with Bennett had circulated through legal circles, she'd become something of an icon for young professionals challenging systemic bias. "They're here for the morning session of court," Bennett said, watching the students. "Would you consider sharing your story with them? Not just about design, but about justice, perception, and the courage to stand up to authority with grace." Sarah considered the invitation, seeing the genuine change in the man who had once dismissed her so readily. "I would be honored," she agreed. "Though perhaps we should start with showing them the evidence of transformation right here." She gestured to the exhibition, where each robe represented a step in the journey from blind authority to enlightened justice. As they walked toward the gathering students, Bennett adjusted his robe one final time. The subtle sheen of the mirror lining caught his reflection, reminding him of the day he learned that true justice requires not just authority, but the wisdom to see beyond first impressions. Behind them, the morning sun continued its journey across the rotunda, illuminating the exhibition's simple but powerful inscription. "Justice wears many faces, but wisdom never goes out of style."